Hello, welcome to the Disney Dyad channel, a channel where I watch and review all of the Disney animated films. We're going to start with the very first full-length animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. This movie was released December 21st, 1937. So within 17 years of this video going up, we're going to be around the 100-year anniversary of the release of this film. This was a very risky thing for Disney to do at the time, too, because all the animated features up to that point were all shorts that would go before the actual film that people paid to go and see. This was the first time that people would go and pay just to see the animated feature instead. So this was a very forward-thinking thing at the time, and people didn't know if it was going to be successful or not. So Disney tried it out, and it was very successful. I'm going to go over my thoughts and some notes I took down, observations of the film. Some of the good things I really like about this thing, it's a very iconic film, and a lot of things still stick out as iconic to this day. The characters are very iconic. Everybody knows the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White is very iconic. She's the one that started the Disney princess craze. And even the Evil Queen, she's very iconic, even in her old hag form. There's a lot of memes that are created about her as that. Another really good thing about this movie is it's very emotionally driven. There's not a lot of backstory given during the movie, but you don't really need it. You can just watch it and understand the feelings of each character, what's going through their head. And you don't need all this backstory, and that helps make it a much more concise film than what it would be if it had a bunch of backstory and prologues. One thing is the dwarfs. They each have very simple traits, but that also helps out you being introduced to each of the dwarfs. Instead of having this dwarf whose name is this, and it's all this, you have very simple names that reflect on their personality. So you have Sleepy, who's often sleepy, and the joke when you're going to see Sleepy getting tired, that's going to be the joke. You have Grumpy. His personality trait is he's always grumpy. So with that, you also eliminate the need to give each dwarf their individual backstory. You just see their name, and you know what their personality trait is, and that helps keep the story concise so you can fall in love with the dwarves without having to know their motivations, their backstories, all of that. There's a lot of really cool scenes in this movie that are actually pretty intense, especially for the time. So the forest scene where Snow White is running through the forest, that's a really good representation of how she probably feels at the time. As you see when she falls over and starts crying, it's just trees. There's nothing to be afraid of. But to her, everything is out to get her because the people that she had in her life up to that point had turned against her and wanted to kill her. The queen wanted her dead. The huntsman was tasked with killing her. Of course, he couldn't bring himself to do it, but that would probably affect her in such a way where she doesn't know who she can trust. The trees might even be out to get her. Another scene that's really cool and that's very intense at the time is the transformation of the queen. The queen brews a potion that turns her into an elderly lady, so she can fool Snow White, and it's very well animated, and it's a really nice animation of the time, and it's still really good to this day. It's not a plot-heavy movie. A lot of the scenes involve just sitting around and watching the characters live out their day. It doesn't have a lot of impact to the plot. So when you see the dwarves dancing, it's not meant to push the plot forward. What you're seeing is the dwarves and Snow White hanging out. And one thing that I do probably have to say is a lot of modern audiences might have a harder time getting through some of these slower scenes, because now an animated movie, it has been perfected to a way where every scene can be used to push the plot forward. But a lot of the scenes in this are actually meant to give you more of an emotional connection to the characters rather than push the plot forward. A thing that I really like that this movie does do is it gives you some good foreshadowing. So when Snow White is discovered by the seven dwarves, they all freak out because they know the queen would have their head if she found out that Snow White was hiding there. And with that, you get to see some of the foreshadowing, see that everyone's terrified of the queen because she has magic, and that she could even be in the room right now and they won't even know. So without having to, show her do all of these things, you get a little bit of foreshadowing. The dwarves are terrified of her, and they have a right to be terrified of her because she's got magic powers. Another thing that they did was they showed that the way to break the curse is with true love's first kiss. And of course, there's the prince in the beginning of the movie, and to help reinforce that Snow White loves the princes, there's a part in the middle where she talks about him. And I feel like that's a really good place to put that, so you don't have to have, a backstory. You can just have a quick thing thrown in, and it shows the emotional connection with Snow White and the prince. A thing I do have to say, though, is with our modern audiences, that might not work out as much. A lot of people probably want to see an actual connection between the two characters. And they probably actually want to, feel the characters interact more, because really Snow White and the prince didn't really interact. They just sung back and forth to each other, and that's their only interaction. I don't know if there's a backstory to that where they've met and talked and actually, know each other. It'd be odd that some random prince is just rolling around Snow White's castle and doesn't know who she is, but like I said, there's not a lot of backstories in this, and a lot of times it doesn't need that. A lot of modern audiences might rather have some backstory, but they don't need that. A lot of the characters in this are very iconic. I feel like out of the seven dwarves, Grumpy is the most popular because there's a lot of merch with Grumpy in it. And a thing that they really do well is when the actual fight goes down between the queen and the seven dwarves, Grumpy is the one that actually takes charge. Up to this point, Grumpy has been, kind of standoffish with Snow White. He's not really interested in having her hang out with them. But you can see a change, and I really like that in this. You see the change in Grumpy. He goes from, being grumpy, being cynical about her being there, and he actually ends up connecting with her, and he's the one that leads the charge against the queen. And that shows how they've changed. And even after Snow White dies, Grumpy breaks down and cries, and that's like a really good point to show that he has changed. He's no longer just grumpy all the time. He's actually being hurt right now. So my final thoughts on this movie is it's a really good movie. It's still very good. A lot of modern audiences might have some trouble getting through the slower stuff, but I think it's still worth it. Go ahead and watch this movie. It is a good starting point if you want to binge through all the Disney movies, and it's still a wonderful, beautifully animated film.